Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Centrist Central Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Bao, and today we have some very special guests with me. I have two police officers, one that's been with the Department of Maryland Heights Police Department for just under 20 years, and the other one's been with the police department for over 30 years. We have Lieutenant Jameson White, and we have Chief Bill Carson. Welcome to the show, guys. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. If you want to just go ahead and introduce yourselves a little bit more, starting with Lieutenant, just a little bit more about your background.
Sure. My name is Jameson White. I've been a police officer for 22 years. I have been a traffic officer, a detective during that time frame, and currently I hold the position of the commander of our Support Services Division, which is the internal affairs and includes our DARE, our dispatch, SROs, and our fleet management aspect of it. I'm also, in my past, I've also been part of the major case squad as a police officer and a motor officer as well.
Sounds good. Chief?
Bill Carson. I'm the police chief in Maryland Heights. I've been a police officer for 41 years. Been with the Maryland Heights Police Department. It'll be 35 years this summer. I have been chief of police for about 7.5 years. And held just about every rank and every position throughout my career before being appointed chief.
Sounds good. Well, very glad to have you guys with us, and hopefully we can have some good, productive dialogue going on. So let's get right into it, shall we? So the very first question we have here is, just to give a little bit of the background, is we have these two established officials, police officers here, because we're trying to work through a lot of the strife that's going through the country right now with the George Floyd protests and a lot of the demands for police reform. So we're just going to try to get a little bit of the perspective from the police, from their perspectives. Obviously, they don't speak for all police, to try to work through it together and just kind of see exactly how they feel about it. So the very first question is, there's a common sentiment whenever we talk about issues with police brutality and things like that. And the common sentiment is that whenever there are issues and bad cases, there is people who defend the police saying that, oh, those cases are just a few bad apples. They don't represent all the police. And obviously that is, there's obviously merit to that. But do you think that with issues with police brutality is more isolated individuals that's an issue? Or do you think that there is some sort of systemic problem either at a national level or at a departmental level that kind of yields the bad apples? And obviously the full phrase is that one bad apple ruins the bunch. So how do you guys feel about that?
There's a lot of aspects to that question, but, is there a systemic police brutality problem in law enforcement? And I would say no, I don't believe so. Are there isolated incidents of police brutality? Yes. Are there bad apples at various places throughout law enforcement? Yes. I think every profession, whether it be doctors, lawyers, clergy, law enforcement, there are bad apples in every profession. You have doctors that make mistakes on their operating table that result in a patient dying. You have clergy that have been accused of sexual misconduct. And we basically don't shut down all the churches in the country because of a few bad apples. What we have to do in law enforcement is we have to do everything we can to avoid hiring bad apples in the first place. But we also have to make sure that we have our early warning systems in place to identify problem employees and either correct the behavior or get rid of the problem employees. So that there's a lot of parts of that. When you talk about police brutality in the United States, I think it's really important to realize we deal with a lot of very, very violent people on a regular basis. Murder, rape, robbery, sexual assault, domestic violence, assault on police officers. We have, in the city of St. Louis, I think so far this year, we've had 133 murders. it's unfortunate, but it seems like drive-by shootings are almost a nightly occurrence, and that has spread into the county. And as a result, even in the municipalities, we're encountering very, very dangerous, armed, violent people on a fairly regular basis. There's about 50 police officers every year in the United States that are killed by gunfire, and many, many more than that are victims of assaults. And, last year in Maryland Heights, we had a police officer shot. I think a lot of people think of Maryland Heights as being a very, very quiet bedroom community, but we're not immune from that in Maryland Heights. So we had a police officer shot in the line of duty. If you look at the nation, big picture, police in the United States make about 11 million arrests every year. There are about 1,000 people killed by the police in this country. And if you calculate that, it is about 1/100th of 1% of the arrest result in someone dying. So a very tiny fraction of a percent. If you look locally, and again, I know 1,000 people in the United States seems like an excessive number, but there are 58,000 police officers that are assaulted every year. So again, we're dealing with some very, very violent people sometimes. In Maryland Heights, we make about 4,000 arrests a year. And of the 4,000 arrests, and again, we're breaking up bar fights, we're dealing with domestic violence, we're dealing with intoxicated people, we're dealing with people that are not rational, not making good decisions. And less than 2% of the arrests that we make involve any use of force. We track all incidents involving force. We review them. We want to make sure every incident is handled properly within policy. And I think, when you look at just the volume of arrests that we make and the fact that less than 2% there's any force involved whatsoever, I think we're doing a pretty good job of dealing with people without having to resort to force.
I'm just going to add, one of the things about the idea about police brutality is, or that there is a systemic problem in that realm, is that we are protecting ourselves better and better as law enforcement, in the fact that we have body cameras now, we have in-car videos. We have a lot more training, a lot more policies in place to protect the community, but also to verify that our officers are doing the things and the goals that we expect of them every day.
Yeah, definitely. So with all of that in mind, obviously there's a very low percentage, like you said, like 100th of a percent, I think you mentioned. With that in mind, there's always room for improvement, of course. And so are there any steps that you guys as a department are taking in order to mitigate any sort of issues with your police department? I know that Maryland Heights is generally a safe and peaceful place, even though you mentioned a lot of the crime is starting to leak into the county. But generally speaking, in comparison to a more heavily dense populated areas, it's more safe. So what steps are you guys taking in order to help curb any sort of incidents that might occur like that?
I know for our department, the Maryland Heights Police Department invests a lot of time and resources in the selection of police officers, but not only the selection, the training, development, and supervision. I think all four of those things are really, really crucial. First of all, you identify the right people, you hire the right people, but once you hire them, the training and the supervision is an ongoing process. We have policies, procedures, rules, and regulations. We have very, very high standards, and we expect our employees to live up to those standards. And again, supervision is a big part of that. I think we've got really outstanding supervisors that have their finger on the pulse, and we have early warning systems in place where we identify if an employee is going off the rails, so to speak. And, there's a lot of different components to that, but all of those combined, I think, help us really keep our finger on the pulse.
And one thing to add to that, too, is our policy, when we have a use of force situation, requires that a supervisor respond to that scene and have hands-on contact with the individual that was arrested or the force was used on. So that also helps with the ability for an individual to, if they have an issue or a problem at that point, to have contact with the supervisor at that moment as well.
Right. And so a lot of what you guys are talking about in terms of gatekeeping a lot of these incidents from happening is supervising and trying to choose good individuals. But, obviously sometimes they seep through the cracks. And a lot of the concern of the general public in terms of these preventative measures that you listed, like having supervisors oversee any sort of excessive use of force cases or anything, is that for, generally most supervisors are good people, but what if, according to a lot of their fears and concerns, the supervisors are a little bit lenient, or they're a little bit more lax, and they overlook a lot of the, finer details in a lot of these force situations. And so is there anything that you guys know of that can kind of curb anything within the department that might sabotage some ill will in that way?
I think, again, we have regular command staff meetings and meetings with our first line supervisors where we talk about just the absolute importance of doing the job and following our policies. I think, we're always open to new ideas, new ways of looking at things. And I think for us, adding body cameras has been a tremendous, they've paid for themselves because we've been able to go back and review incidents, and what we found when we audit the body cameras, we review incidents, we review use of force incidents, it kind of confirms our belief that our police officers do act professionally and that they use tremendous restraint. And I'll give you an interesting example. We had a gentleman that filed a complaint with our internal affairs, and he alleged that that a police officer used excessive force on him. And the person, when he filed the complaint, was not aware that the whole incident had been captured on body camera video. And he alleged that the police officer had used excessive force. When the internal affairs investigator brought the complainant in, he sat down with him and he played the video from body camera. And the video showed that the officer did not use excessive force and in fact had handled himself in a very, very professional manner. The person watching the body camera video, when the video concluded, the person looked at the investigator and said, "I'd like to withdraw my complaint." And so we'll probably never know how many complaints were fabricated or were embellished. But now that we have body cameras, this is a way that the chief, the assistant chief, anyone on the command staff can go back and review the actions of an employee.
Another side of that, too, is our policies. We do regulate and require the officers to intercede and intervene in a use of force situation where something seems excessive or unreasonable. And we are also have, the disciplinary side of that is that there could be some pretty heavy discipline if they decide not to either report the excessive or unreasonable use of force to a supervisor, or if that supervisor is involved, to report it to the supervisor above them.
And so is that a policy that's pretty much widely adopted throughout the nation, or is that just specific to Maryland Heights?
So I'll speak to that. The Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies is called the CALEA for short. The St. Louis area has a lot of departments that use these standards that are set forth by the CALEA organization. And the standards give guidelines for departments and how their policies should be structured and how they should have their procedures in place. So most agencies that are CALEA accredited agencies will have very similar policies because these standards are pretty much across the board. But there's not a lot of agencies in the United States that have the CALEA accreditation. There are other accreditation entities in the state, but for the most part, you would find your use of force policies would mirror or look very similar to other agencies. Some aspects may be a little bit different, like, for instance, us having a supervisor, requiring a supervisor to respond to a use of force scenario that might be different than what other agencies would require, depending on their size and their ability to have supervisors respond, in a timely manner.
And that's one thing that I've seen across the country. There's a wide range in police agencies across the nation. I think only about 5% of law enforcement agencies in the United States have the CALEA accreditation. Those agencies that do have very, very similar policies. But again, there's a lot of agencies that are not accredited or not certified. And it depends. Every agency is different. So it depends what agency you're talking about.
And for these agencies, is there kind of like a hierarchy of prestige associated with having accreditations from each individual agency? So you're saying that Maryland Heights is accredited through CALEA, and I'm assuming there's a lot of other agencies like you mentioned. Is CALEA kind of like very reputable or very respectable in comparison to other agencies, or are they just all too different to really say?
It's an international program, so okay. It is a respected program, but it does cost money to be accredited, and so I think that may be one of the aspects of why some agencies find it harder to get the accreditation. It also requires a lot of man hours to get the standards accomplished and to prove the standards and to get the policies in place. So there is a lot of work to that accreditation process, and some agencies, particularly probably smaller ones, would find it more difficult to do that. It's just one of those things you have to kind of dedicate yourself to, and that's one commitment we made here, to be as professional as we can and to meet those standards.
I think CALEA is probably the gold standard of accreditation bodies. I think, but again, it's a significant investment in time and also a financial investment.
Right. So speaking of body cams, is there a procedure or rules or guidelines in terms of when the body cams need to be running and whether or not they can be edited or tampered with? Because a lot of the concerns is that sometimes if, hypothetically, if a police officer wants to do something that he or she knows is wrong, they just switch it off or edit it or delete it later. So is there anything that helps prevent that from happening?
I'll speak to that. I was actually part of the team that got us the body cameras over a year ago. Our policies are very strict about the guidelines for when the officers are to activate the body camera, the in-car camera. They are activated automatically depending on if they're in the car and they turn the lights on. That's one aspect of it. But they do not have the ability to tamper with the video. They do not have the ability to alter the video. They do not have the ability to delete any videos. That is, once the videos have been captured and created, there's just not the possibility. And they do download automatically as they come to the station. They're not able to interfere with that. If somebody was to tamper with those cameras or the devices, they do track that. So anything that occurs with that would be unusual, every aspect of that camera is tracked and able to be downloaded later to look at any kind of tampering. And same with the program itself. There's no editing. There's no ability to change anything from the officers, at least with the particular program that we're using.
There is a commander on the department that has the ability to redact, a certain video that's released to the public that might have social security numbers or confidential restricted information or blur faces of children, that type of thing. So we have a commander that has the ability to go in and redact video, but I think there's a trail of anything that's done, and it doesn't alter the original video.
Right. And is there a separate agency that oversees that body camera footage, or just use of force cases in general, or is it always like an internal investigation with departmental commanders?
We have, that is our responsibility, and we maintain it and we review it. But in certain incidents, we could ask another agency to come in for an independent assessment of an incident. And then obviously, body camera video on criminal incidents goes to the St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, and they review the body camera video before they file criminal charges. So there are people outside of our department that ultimately will look at the video depending on the circumstances.
Gotcha. Cool. So moving on a little bit from body cameras, you mentioned a little bit how to prevent a lot of these incidents from occurring, it starts from choosing the good people to join the force to begin with. And so that actually brings us to a lot of the talking points that people bring up in terms of wanting to increase training restrictions and things like that. And a lot of people are talking about how there needs to be more de-escalation and things like that in terms of training. I know you guys only speak about Maryland Heights or whatever other departments you may have worked for, but what does the training look like for a new recruit or somebody going through the academy in terms of de-escalation? Are people, because for the general population, we don't exactly know what goes on behind the doors of the police. Are people a little bit off base in terms of demanding more de-escalation training, or is that something that you can definitely get on board with?
Well, I think, and I speak from many years of experience in law enforcement. I went through the police academy in 1979, and I could say absolutely, without a doubt, police officers today are better trained than they have ever been in the 41 years I've been in law enforcement. They receive training on crisis intervention, mental health issues, de-escalation, implicit bias, racial profiling. There's so many, control of conflict, use of less lethal options. I think the officers that are going through the police academy today receive 6 months of very, very intensive training before they ever come out of the academy. And then once they get out of the academy, then there's field training. And then in the state of Missouri, you're licensed by the state as a law enforcement officer. And in order to maintain that license, you have to have a minimum of 24 hours of ongoing training every year in certain areas: racial profiling, firearms, communication, racial profiling. There's a lot of different things that you've got to have 24 hours every year. Our department, Maryland Heights, we often have our officers receive far more than what the law requires. And we're very fortunate in Maryland Heights. We have some resources that maybe other communities don't have. And we invest a lot of money in training. We send some of our officers all over the country to some of the very, very best training that we can find. Our training budget in Maryland Heights this year is $120,000. And so we believe in training. We believe in making sure our police officers have all the resources, all the tools, and all the training they need to do the job.
I'm going to add to that, we do have we require quite a bit of firearms training, which is part of the post that the chief was talking about, requirements for the state, but we go above and beyond with that firearms training as well, which includes a simulator, and that simulator is a digital, large, multiple screen, basically like a video game. But it puts the officers in scenarios where they have to make decisions about de-escalation. They have to make decisions about the type of force that they're going to use, and their commands, the verbiage and the way that they're addressing individuals in that particular scenario gives the instructor the ability to change how the actors within the video react. So if they're not giving the appropriate commands, that individual may not respond appropriately. So it builds into the training that de-escalation techniques and the idea that it doesn't always have to go any further if they're using the correct communication and they're saying the right things.
So with that shooting simulator then, if I'm interpreting that correctly, are you saying that there are a lot of different scenarios built into where it kind of tests their de-escalation a little bit?
There's a variety of different situations and scenarios that are not all involved in just shooting situations. They are definitely situations where you might go to a less lethal form of maybe pepper spray or a beanbag round in that particular case, or maybe your verbal commands are enough to where no force is needed, and in theory that would be the ultimate goal for the de-escalation. Certainly that's not always going to work, but it does get officers thinking about that and get them in that mindset for sure.
Right. So just a quick question for you, Chief. Whenever you're mentioning, you said talking about how much money going toward training for Maryland Heights specifically, you mentioned a figure of about $120,000, correct?
Yes.
How much total funding do you receive then from the state? And because I'm wondering what the proportion of how much funding you receive from the state, or I'm assuming it's from the state, right?
No, actually it's not. It is almost 99% of our funding comes from the city of Maryland Heights. We do have a police training fund where we get a small amount of money from the state post-commission training fund that is to be used for enhanced training, but that's a very, very small percentage of our budget. The great majority of it comes from the city of Maryland Heights.
Okay, and so are you able to give us a breakdown then of what that budget looks like how how much goes into training and how much goes into equipment and how much goes into salary?
The Maryland Heights Police Department has 100 employees, and we have a $12.3 million annual budget. Of that $12.3 million, 88% goes towards salaries and benefits. So personnel costs eat up a big chunk of our budget. 88% goes towards salaries and benefits. I think this year, 2.2% went toward fleet rotation. We replace 6, 7, 8 police cars every year, high mileage cars, and we rotate them. So every year we have money in the budget to replace our older police cars. I said $120,000 for training. That's about 1% of our budget. So that leaves 9%. The remaining 9% goes toward uniforms, equipment, office supplies, gasoline for our fleet, maintenance for our fleet, repairs, tires. We have prisoner meals that we have to pay for. We have expenses related to our in-camera video systems, our body camera systems, our records management system. So that remaining 9% goes toward all those things.
Right. And so do you think that $120,000 or the 1%, do you think that's generally sufficient in terms of the goals you want to meet with training? Or do you think that you either need more funding or you need to reevaluate a little bit of the distribution of the funds in terms of trying to elevate the training?
Well, it's been my experience that the mayor and the city council have been very, very supportive of the police department, and most agencies that I have dealt with feel like they do not have enough resources, enough funding to pay for all the training that they want to be able to pay for. And obviously, if we had more money, we would send our people to even more training. But I think compared to a lot of other law enforcement agencies, the money that we have allocated for training is really pretty good compared to a lot of other departments.
And keep in mind too that some of the training actually there's no expense to us. We do pay for some police academy training, but some officers are able to attend training that's absolutely free. So that 120 is just a portion of what the training actually extends from.
Right. So something that I heard about with the training is that sometimes, like you said, I guess it's kind of like, can it be summarized as like in-house training where you said it's not as much like cost as it's kind of like free? Is it like a lot of your more senior officers training the recruits?
We have individual supervisors and officers that are specifically trained to be trainers. And then also we use a virtual academy program that is an all online based training that we can go through and kind of pick and choose what we feel is good for our officers. There's quite a bit of good de-escalation training available through that program and legal updates and a variety of different topics. And the nice thing about something like that is where an officer may not normally be able to get extensive training on maybe something like child trafficking, that maybe they could get that through this virtual academy program. So it is nice to have other avenues than just in-person training, but we do extensive in-house training as well.
This year, we've been really impacted by the coronavirus. We've had to cancel a lot of out-of-town travel and training because of the coronavirus. But typically in a normal year, we send some of our officers to just some of the best conferences throughout the country. The Crimes Against Children conference in Dallas every year. We usually send people from our detective bureau to that. So there's a lot of really, really outstanding training that we do send people to. All of our commanders have gone to either the FBI National Academy or the Northwestern University Center for Public Safety. They have a 10-week school of staff and command that is for command rank officers. And every one of our commanders have either been to the FBI Academy or Northwestern. So there's a lot of different enhanced training that we send our people to.
Gotcha. And so the reason why I brought that up is just because I heard a sentiment from another police officer just online that he feels that the department that he worked for, their training could be expanded a little bit because he was saying that a lot of the outside training that you're mentioning, either going out to like another state or having some sort of outside training coming in, that could be expanded upon because that's very brief and they just don't have enough money to cover that. So obviously you have expressed that you feel that Maryland Heights has been doing a pretty good job with training, but do you think that overall as a country training could be, I guess more funds should be allocated toward training, or what can be improved on a national scale?
Well, again, on a national scale, you have a lot of poor communities, you have a lot of rural law enforcement agencies, sheriff's departments that really struggle to purchase equipment, replace police vehicles. I've done a lot of training around the state where we've gone and presented training in various parts of the state and other states as well. And I've been in areas that they are just starving for good training, and they don't have the funding to be able to send people to the training. And so it really ranges from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I know that some places just do not have the money to be able to send their people to quality training. So, I do feel very fortunate in Maryland Heights that we're able to do that, but I know it's not the same with every agency out there.
We are very fortunate in Missouri to have the post requirements here for our training. I don't think all states or areas have those types of requirements. So getting that training to those areas and then having those states require training for law enforcement might help, and I maybe force the hand a little bit in getting those agencies to get that training available, whether the state helps fund it or a federal government entity funds it. That might be an opportunity to try to get that ball rolling, to get that training, out there.
Right, yeah. Because I think that is a lot of people's concerns. Obviously, Maryland Heights is fortunate, as you guys mentioned, but a lot of the departments that may not have a lot of money to allocate toward training, there seems to be some association between that and just how many crimes and how many cases of use of force that they have to deal with in general. So that's definitely something that I think that a lot of people can try to work on.
Well, while you're on that topic too, the defunding the police would be, they really probably a bad idea in the sense that if you're wanting more training and we don't get training from the state, as far as the money afforded to us or the federal government, it comes from internally from our department. We budget that, but taking money away from an agency would probably make it even more difficult to get that training and get officers trained to train other officers too.
Right. So speaking of defund the police, you were mentioning that if we wanted better training, the money's got to come from somewhere. And so if people are advocating for better training, but also at the same time advocating for defunding the police, it seems a little bit counterintuitive. So do you have an argument to try to change people's minds? Because in a day and age where there's such a popular movement as defund the police, it's going to be hard to get people to take a 180. Like, actually, no, we need more money for police.
Yeah, it's... I know that for some people it seems like, that's the solution, take money from the police and put it towards social services. But the reality is, if you take money from the police departments are not going to be able to provide the same level of service. And especially some of the high crime neighborhoods that need the police the most, they're going to suffer the most. Response times are going to suffer. We're not going to be able to provide police officers with the same tools and equipment to do the job. We're not going to be able to attract and retain the same quality of applicants because, obviously if you take money from the police, that's going to affect salary and benefits and salary, benefits, equipment, training, all of those things are really going to have a negative impact on the police and their ability to provide service to the community, their ability to solve crimes. And, putting money towards social services will certainly help social services, but it will not solve crimes.
We in law enforcement have spent a number of years trying to create a community policing model. That was a very big thing leading through the 80s into the 90s and 2000s. And it was very important for us to have that connection to the community. We've spent many years building those programs and building the relationships with the community on a variety of different levels, whether that's through DARE programs or student resource officers, public relations information officers, these positions that are so important in having daily contact with our community, our students in the community. And I feel if we defunded the police, the department's responsibility ultimately is to keep this community safe. And so when those officers or those salaries are reduced or you reduce the number of officers, those specialized positions are going to be some of the first positions to go, those community policing positions. And you're going to begin to see a vacuum, I feel, in the whole theory about how wonderful community policing has been. And it has been really great in a lot of different varieties and entities and programs that are way more expansive than things that we've been able to provide even at a city at our level. I think that vacuum in the community policing model could make things more difficult.
So do you think that then if we were to go through with defunding police, there is no going around with cutting corners with skimming a little bit off the top with police salaries and training and some of the more specialized positions, like you said? Or do you think that as a department, you would be able to trim the fat around in other areas that you may be spending a little bit more in excess without having to compromise in areas like training, salary, and specialized positions?
You know what? We don't feel, when we look at our budget, we don't feel like we've got a lot of fat. The reality is, if our budget was cut significantly, we would have to eliminate positions, or salary and benefits would suffer. We would not be able to provide the equipment that we do. That's just the reality. It's we're not going to be able to provide the same level of service to the community.
We have a very extensive budget process, and one thing we don't have is expendable funds, or just funds that are thrown at us. The process is, we may want a submarine, but when we get to that point, there's other entities, or Public Safety Committee, the City Council, the City Administrator. They all review our budgets and they cut those items out. So our budgets are scrutinized, and any government entity will tell you that typically you have a very extensive process to get to that point. So there's certainly not a lot of excessive items or things that we're putting into the budget that are just allowed because we just want that. We have to justify those things extensively in that budgetary process. And I think, as the chief said, if we begin to cut some of those items, it would be difficult to get police officers on the street, to have quality equipment, to have quality vehicles, and to do their jobs.
Right. So obviously, if that's the case, then I'm assuming you guys would be on board if, instead of a movement to defund the police, if we were to ask maybe on a city level or a state level to maybe reallocate funds up there. Because I think that if you were to ask any agency, whether it be a police department or a state department or anything, to cut funds, everybody's going to say that they're strapped to begin with. The country as a whole owes a lot of money. So, what do you think is a solution then for that?
I like the idea what you said. I think at the federal level, down to the state level, it would be nice to have some programs in place that were provided for those entities and agencies that don't have the resources that we have provided to us. So if you could have programs where they maybe go out into those communities, into those cities and those police departments and areas, and provide that training at that level, particularly the things that are of great importance, like right now, de-escalation training, use of force, those types of entities, where you could have someone getting into the areas that maybe aren't having the ability to get to that training, would probably be an ideal situation.
Right. And so with that in mind, then, how do you feel about the idea that, keeping in mind that if we were to defund the police, we ultimately would have to sacrifice a little bit in areas that maybe people wouldn't want. But let's just say we go through with defunding the police to a certain extent, hopefully not as much as 50% or so, but just enough to where you can reallocate to social services. And so a lot of the defense about that, and a lot of people's reasoning for advocating for that, is that ideally, if you were to do that, you would cut down on crime rates in general, and you would cut down on police responsibilities. And we know that in Minneapolis, they already are in the process of restructuring the police department so that there's not as much of a heavy burden on the police there, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all with the police there, and they have more specialized departments for specifically drug-related calls or more specifically mental health issue-related causes. And so the idea behind reallocating funds and restructuring police is that hopefully you guys don't need that much money to begin with. So how do you guys feel about that?
Law enforcement agencies vary so much across the country, and problems that you see in one community you might not see it in another community. I can look at it big picture, but if I look at it just the city of Maryland Heights and the services that we provide to the community of Maryland Heights, I know that the residents of Maryland Heights love the police department and love the services that the police department provides to the community. And I know And again, we're accountable to a mayor and a city council. They're elected. They're obviously accountable to the residents and the voters of Maryland Heights. But I know that when we go through our budget process every year, we have to justify everything that we ask for. But the end result is that the residents of Maryland Heights are really happy with the services provided by the police department. So if you want to come in to the Maryland Heights Police Department and cut our budget by 50%, I don't believe that's what the residents of Maryland Heights want. I don't believe that's what the elected officials of Maryland Heights want. I think they are very, very happy with the police department. Now, you might not be able to say that about the Minneapolis Police Department or other police departments, but when I look at just this community, I don't see something that is broken that needs to be fixed.
And keeping in mind, if you defunded the police and put that money towards social programs or entities, you would have to provide, people 24-hour service in those spots. Policemen are social workers. We are therapists. We're mental health experts, legal experts. Every day there was many different hats that they wear depending on the call and the nature that they're dealing with. But having a mental health expert available in a response time that's less than 4 minutes is not realistic. Or having a social worker that's available within that similar kind of time frame where people want that instantaneous, hey, I need this help, I need it right now. It would be very difficult to separate a situation where you might have a mental health situation going on and you need an immediate response, but your mental health professional's an hour away because they're in another community. We, as policemen, we drive around. The policemen are very accessible to the community and able to help deal with those situations. Unfortunately, I think if you were to defund and put that money towards a social work program, you're going to have to provide those people with vehicles. You're going to have to provide them with the number of different employees in a different variety of training levels, and you're still going to have that aspect of requiring the training and requiring their ability. In our day and age in our society and the technology that we have, people want an instantaneous response. They want answers immediately. And we know just from our history, because social workers are limited in their numbers, it is difficult to get somebody to respond in a timely manner, whereas our response time is typically within just a few minutes.
Right. That's definitely a very interesting aspect I think a lot of people don't consider is the actual logistics of implementing all those social services to kind of fill in the gap for this supposed restructuring. We'll see exactly what's going to happen with Minneapolis since they're kind of spearheading this on a national level. But I speak from my experience as a psychology major. There's a lot of people who want to go into social services, but the social services want a lot more people to go into it. And on top of that, a lot of people burn out very quickly. And so it's definitely something that I think is an interesting point to bring up is actually how would we implement that if we were to do that. So if I were to interpret that a little bit correctly, if we could figure out those logistics, right? If for some reason we had this budget and we could fix all of that and be able to support these 24-hour services and cars and things like that for social services to respond, if somehow we're able to do that, do you think that it would be an effective restructuring, or do you think still at the end of the day, it's still better to have a police officer respond first?
I like the idea of having somebody that would be more dedicated to an individual entity or department like us. It would be really nice to have a mental health professional and a social worker that works directly for the department or for the city that would be a resource for us that'd be have a more immediate response. It certainly would provide those additional resources and get people more help more quickly, I feel. But we do have to remember a lot of times with our social services calls with domestic violence or mental health individuals having mental health issues, they can be combative. There can be assaults that have occurred. So a lot of times those calls require the police to go to begin with. But I think having a resource that would be available to us more instantaneously and maybe a 24-hour resource that's at the local level, that may not be such a bad idea to have, using a little bit of money to build something, like that.
Right. And so speaking of these calls getting violent, a lot of people are calling for the disarming of police. they feel that having police, every single officer, walk around or drive around with a gun on their hip can kind of incite violence, whether or not they mean to. The fact that you have an officer with a gun is a little bit analogous to somebody walking around with a hammer and treating everything like a nail, right? And so how do you feel, from your guys' perspectives, the idea of disarming police would be? And obviously, it wouldn't be like a blanket thing. It's not like all police have no more guns, but to some extent, trying to disarm them somehow to make it so that hopefully that won't incite as much violence. How do you feel about that?
Well, I am absolutely opposed to that suggestion. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of very, very naive people that really have no idea how much violence and evil there is in the world. And again, we're dealing on a regular basis with a lot of very, very violent, dangerous people, sometimes that are more heavily armed than we are. And I said there are, on average, 50 police officers every year that are killed by gunfire, and countless more police officers that are shot at or wounded. So if you take guns from police officers, you're putting them at a tremendous disadvantage, and I think you would have a lot more police officers that would get killed or seriously injured. And then also, if you look at our country, the number of active shooter incidents that happen in schools, churches, malls, theaters, do you really want an unarmed police officer responding to Sandy Hook Elementary School to stop an active shooter? And how is an unarmed police officer going to stop an active shooter from killing children? We train our officers that they immediately respond to the scene. They go into that school and they stop the active shooter. They don't pull up and wait for somebody to deliver a gun to them, or they don't pull up and wait for the SWAT team to arrive. We learned from Columbine that, when you delay going into a situation like that, kids get killed. And so again, do you really, really want an unarmed police officer to go try to stop a school shooting? So, I would be really, really opposed to, taking firearms away from police officers.
And I have heard about them having a traffic division or a specific division that maybe it's just unarmed. But even in a scenario like that, a lot of police officers are assaulted, shot, and killed during traffic stops. Those are sometimes some of the most volatile situations that occur because the criminals are in vehicles. They have guns. They have the drugs. And I think you'd be putting police or those particular entities in quite a bit of danger by having them unarmed. I think the answer to that is better training and making sure that firearms training is extensive throughout the nation.
So do you think that there is any merit then to the idea that carrying a firearm does incite more violence? Because it comes a little bit from the philosophy that if you come at people with a certain level of force, they're going to respond at an equal or greater force, right? And I think that's only natural. I guess from your guys' perspective, it would be that there are criminals out in the streets and they have guns. So obviously, cops need to rise to the occasion and meet them or go beyond that with how well equipped you are. But do you think that the expectations can be flipped a little bit in terms of if people see cops walking around with guns and they feel threatened by that, do you think that there is merit to the idea that they're going to be more violent as a result?
I haven't particularly seen that in my career and in dealing with individuals on a variety of different levels and scenarios, whether it be at schools or at the store. I think law enforcement has been around for so long in the United States, and even back to the Old West, where officers had guns. I think it is kind of the norm. Now I can understand why maybe somebody that's uncomfortable with guns or somebody that isn't familiar with them could be intimidated by that. But at the same time, it is a balance. I think, as we spoke about, it is an important tool for us to have when needed, and which is not utilized very, very often. But if it's needed, it needs to be there.
I think There might be some countries with very, very low levels of violence where police officers can be unarmed and function. But in the United States, where we have an unbelievable amount of violent crime, I think putting unarmed officers up against armed people is not a good solution.
Right. So something that kind of plays into that a little bit is obviously here in Maryland Heights, Missouri, we're very close to St. Louis City and Ferguson, where all that strife was happening, actually more or less the home of, or the birthplace of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014. And so with that said, and with how racially charged St. Louis is, there's a lot of distrust among communities and officers and their respective police departments. And maybe having firearms plays a role in that, but what do you think can help alleviate some of that distrust between, underrepresented communities and maybe underfunded police departments? Because like you said, a lot of these issues kind of come down to crime rates and also just the lack of funding that they receive either from the city or the state. And so what can other police departments do, can you think from your experience with Ferguson or anything else, that they can help improve with that distrust?
I think there's, if you go back to President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and that came out after the events in Ferguson. And I know there were a lot of recommendations for law enforcement that came out of that. There's the 6 pillars and, building trust and legitimacy, training and education. There's of course, officer wellness and safety. There's a lot of different things I think that have been embraced by police departments that, it's so important. And we realize that there is a segment of our population that doesn't like the police, doesn't trust the police. Community policing is very, very, is another pillar, and it's certainly very, very important. But, it's interesting. In St. Louis, and I said that so far this year there have been, last time I looked, 133 murders in the city of St. Louis. The overwhelming majority of those murders have been blacks killing blacks. And, there's a lot of problems in poverty, gangs, drugs, single-parent families, lack of role models. There's a lot of different issues going on in the community. I looked at something the other day, and it said blacks between the ages of 10 and 43 are 13 times more likely to be murdered than whites in that same age group. And it's not because the police are killing them. There's other reasons why we're having those problems in some neighborhoods. And we have to continue to try to build trust and build a relationship with those communities. What I have found is that even in those high crime neighborhoods, there's a lot of really, really decent people that are begging for police protection. They want the police to be there. They want the police to do everything that we can to try to protect the community. And I think, it's kind of interesting. There's been some studies that shown that, when there's the Ferguson effect, that police become afraid to be proactive. They back off. And when they back off, violent crime goes up. And I just read something recently. I thought it was really interesting. In New York City, because of some of the civil unrest, they recently dissolved a 600-man anti-crime unit. This was a gun suppression unit. Their mission was to go into the community and try to get guns off the street. And they were very good at what they did. They got a lot of guns off the street, but because of the civil unrest, the New York City Police Department decided to dissolve that unit. And once they dissolved the unit, the New York City Police Department backed off on making gun arrests. As a result, shootings and murders in New York City have spiked. And I just read something the other day where leaders in the black community are begging the New York City Police Department to put that unit back together, which I was a little surprised when I read that. But, some part of the community do not want us to do proactive policing. Other parts of the community are begging us to try to stop the violence. So, again, this is a problem. I wish there was an easy solution. If there was an easy solution, I think we would have done it a long time ago. But there's a lot of different reasons why we see the level of violence in some of these neighborhoods. And again, we're trying to do everything we can to protect people and to solve crimes.
And then quickly, just to build that trust, I think police departments need to be transparent in the events that have occurred within their communities. And civilian oversight probably wouldn't be such a bad idea either. Having an entity outside the city's, structure to be able to review incidents, whether they be shootings or use of force incidents, that are of significant nature, I think would probably help a little bit with building some of that trust as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I know we didn't get to a lot of the questions, but I really appreciate you guys being here. And just so that we don't end on such a serious note, we do have one question that's a little bit more in a light manner, is whether or not the stereotype that police officers love donuts is true. And regardless of if that's true, do you have a favorite donut shop that you recommend people to go to?
Doesn't everybody love donuts?
Everybody does.
I do not eat a lot of donuts because I try to keep my girlish figure, but Tony's Donuts here in Maryland Heights is a wonderful donut place. Really, really good donuts there.
I highly recommend Tony's Donuts, and I've seen over the years that there's been a little bit of a transition. I see more bagel eating police officers than I used to.
What the health craze?
That's right. But still, whenever someone shows up here at the station with a dozen donuts, they generally get consumed pretty quickly.
Well, you heard it here. Everybody loves donuts. It's not just police officers. Well, thank you very much for joining us here today. We very much appreciate your time and your input. It's very good perspectives. We thank the Chief Carson and Lieutenant White for joining us, and we hope. Unfortunately, we didn't get through all the questions, but maybe sometime in the future we can set something up again. Otherwise, are there any other last remarks you guys would like to say?
I just want to say, thank you for the opportunity to respond to something. I know these are issues that really are on the hearts and minds of a lot of people, and obviously there's a lot of turmoil in the country, and we're all looking for solutions. We're all looking for ways that we could do better. And I didn't get a chance to say this earlier, but our command staff looks at all of the incidents that happen around the country. And we ask ourselves, could this happen in Maryland Heights? Is there something we need to do differently? And I know that when we saw the video from George Floyd, we talked about it with our command staff. And we want to learn from those incidents. We want to make sure that we don't repeat some of the mistakes that others have made. So, it is unfortunate that, you see things that happen. I truly believe they are isolated incidents, but I also think you can learn from it. And so that's something, we do a lot of debriefing with our command staff and our supervisors, and we talk about what ifs. And we look at these situations and we ask ourselves, how could it have been handled differently? What should have been done? How can we take this to roll call and talk with our officers and maybe help them to develop better strategies and obviously, we don't ever want to see anything in Maryland Heights like what happened in Minneapolis. So again, we try to learn from those things.
We can always be better. You said that earlier, and I absolutely agree with that philosophy. As police departments, if we don't evolve in the times that we're going through right now, and we don't see the things that we need to do to change to be better, then that's a failure on our part. So, hopefully that even just conversations like this are so important to begin that process of recognizing the areas where we can refine and provide training and become better police officers and better police agency.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for your input. Very happy to have you guys on. And thank you all, everybody who's watching and listening. Thank you for watching another episode of the Centrist Central Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Bao, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.